الله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Inshallah, we will begin this week's lesson by looking at the Masa al-Khuffain section of Mukhtasar al-Quduri. Now, Masa al-Khuffain is the Arabic word which literally means wiping wet hands over leather socks. Now, before we go into the complexities of this particular section, the main point which needs to be highlighted and clarified is that in Surah Al-Ma'idah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the procedure and the method of performing wuzu, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhal lazina amanu iza kumtum ila salah. That all those who believe, when you intend to read namaz, when you intend to pray, faghsilu wujuhakum, wash your face, wa aydiyakum ila al-marafiq, wash your arms up to your elbows, wamsahu bi ru'usikum, do masa of your head, wa arjulakum ila al-ka'bayn, and wash your feet up to your ankles. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very clear when it comes to the procedure of wuzu. And He says that if you want to read namaz, or if you want to touch the Quran, or you want to do things which requires wuzu, you have to do 4 things. Wash your face, arms, masa of your head, and wash your feet. And the scholars of tafsir or of the Holy Quran, call them mufassirin, and jurists, they categorize these types of verses to be mutawatir, or to be more simple, basically strong and clear verses. And it's only when there is a strong evidence or strong hadith, or when there is a hadith or a narration which has been narrated by many people, only then you will be allowed to slightly move away from that particular verse and do something else. If there are 1 or 2 hadiths, or if the hadiths are weak, then you won't be able to drop or stop acting upon the verse of the Holy Quran and act upon the hadith. But instead you will have to let go of the hadith and act upon the Quranic verse. Now, with regards to the issue of doing masa over leather socks, approximately 80 companions, and out of those 80 companions, 10 of them are the Asharai Mubashara, those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted Jannah and paradise. They have narrated hadiths and traditions that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would do masa over his khuffain, and that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would do masa over his leather socks. And because of the sheer number of narrations and traditions and hadiths, we are then allowed to slightly move away from the clear, strong verse of the Holy Quran, and therefore the ruling is given that if a person, if he is wearing leather socks, then he doesn't have to take off his leather socks and wash his feet, but instead he could still have his leather socks on and do masa over them, and by doing masa over them, his wuzu will be considered complete and valid. So that is the kind of meaning, or shall I say the history or the Sharia point of view when it comes to masa al-khuffain, that generally speaking we shouldn't be doing masa over our leather socks, because the Quran is clear and it tells us that you have to wash your feet. But when there are so many hadiths, 80 or more Sahabas have narrated the hadith and have said that you can do masa over your leather socks, so therefore it will be permissible for us to not to wash our feet, but if we are wearing leather socks, we can do masa over them. Because unlike other obligations which we have looked at thus far, like for example last week we looked at tayammum, the order or the prescription of tayammum is found in the actual Quran itself. But with regards to masa over your leather socks, it's not actually found in the Holy Quran. So therefore it takes a very strong dalil and evidence and lot of hadiths to then slightly move away from the clear and main text of the Holy Quran and act upon this particular hadith. Now let's look at the section of khuffain in a bit more detail. Now the word khuf in Arabic, literally it means something which is hard and something which is strong. And that's why if you look in the Arabic language, you will find that the Arabs will describe, or the Arabs would call the hooves of camel khuf. The reason being is because the hooves of a camel tends to be hard and strong. So therefore the Arabs would use the word khuf to describe the hooves of camels. Similarly, if you were to open a dictionary, you will also see that the word khuf is also used to describe the hooves of ostrich. Because ostrich is one of those animals which always running and can reach up to speeds of like 70 miles per hour. So it's a very fast animal. So for a fast animal or for an animal which does a lot of running, it needs strong soles and it needs strong hooves and shoes. So therefore the Arabs would use the word khuf to describe the hooves of ostriches. So just from the literal meaning of the word khuf, we can first of all derive that masa over leather socks or khuffain has to be such a special type of sock which is hard and strong, and that masa over thin socks or over nylon socks, then that would not be considered valid or sufficient. So that's what we can just, first of all just derive from the literal meaning, is that doing masa over your normal socks would not be allowed. Why? Because khuf literally means something hard and something which is strong, and we can see that nylon socks or woolen socks or cotton socks, these kind of socks are very thin, and the word khuf would not be appropriate to use to describe those kind of socks. Then we look at the technical meaning of the word khuf. Now what does khuf mean in Islam? Now in Islam or in the Sharia, khuf is a word or is a special type of sock which must have three conditions. And if these three conditions are found, then you can call it a khuf. And if these three conditions are not found, then it's not called a khuf. So what are the three conditions? Number one is that it has to be waterproof. It has to be waterproof. Number two is that it is possible to walk for 3 miles without it ripping, without it tearing. So the second condition is that it is possible to walk for 3 miles without it tearing, without it ripping. And the third condition is that it remains in position by itself, i.e. there is no elastic or no kind of rubber band or something like that keeping the khuf or the socks in its place, but by itself it remains in position. So these three conditions needs to be found for something to be called a khuf. And as we can see that nylon socks, woolen socks, cotton socks and so on, they don't fit these three criteria and they don't fit these three conditions. Because a nylon sock, say for example, if we were to pour a glass of water over it, I could guarantee you that water will seep underneath. Similarly, nylon socks, again, I could guarantee you that if you were to walk outside for 3 miles, you probably would not be able to do a mile before it will tear and rip. And similarly, with regards to the nylon socks and woolen socks which we are wearing now, they don't actually stay by itself, but instead it needs a rubber band or an elastic inside to keep it firm on our feet. So the 3 conditions which needs to be found for something to be called a khuf, they are not found in nylon socks, in woolen socks, in cotton socks. So therefore we can derive that it is not permissible to do masa over these types of socks for your wuzu to be valid and accepted. Now, just to move a bit further, 2 great Hanafi scholars, one called Allama Ibn Nujaym rahmatullah alayh, who's written a book called Bahrul Ra'iq, and also Imam Kasani rahmatullah alayh, who's written a book called Badayu Sanai. And these 2 scholars have quite clearly mentioned that it is a consensus or a ijma of the jurists and of the ulama that if the sock is raqiq, that if it's thin, then it is not permissible to do masa over it. So a thin sock, like your nylon socks, your cotton socks and so on, because it does not fulfill the 3 conditions or criteria I mentioned above, so therefore under no circumstances you will be allowed to do masa over them. Now some may argue here and some may object and say that, well, there are some hadiths which actually says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over non-leather socks. And the Arabic word to describe a non-leather sock is called jawrab. So some may argue and say that, well, why is all this commotion and why is all this hoo-ha, where actually there are hadiths where it says Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over non-leather socks. So why am I saying that you can't do masa over non-leather socks? Whereas quite clearly says there are hadiths that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over jawrabain, over non-leather socks. Now the answer to that particular i'tiraz or objection is that there are only 3 hadiths out of the thousands of hadiths in Sahih al-Bukhari, in Sahih al-Muslim, in Sunan Abu Dawood, in Sunan Tirmidhi, out of all the books of hadith, you can only find 3 hadiths where it says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over non-leather socks. The 3 hadiths, number 1, the first hadith narrated by Hazrat Bilal radhiyallahu anhu can be found in Tabrani, in Mu'jam al-Saghir of Imam Tabrani rahmatullah alayh. The second hadith narrated by Hazrat Abu Musa al-Ashari radhiyallahu anhu can be found in Sunan Ibn Majah. And the third hadith narrated by Hazrat Mughira bin Shu'bah radhiyallahu anhu can be found in Tirmidhi, Sunan Tirmidhi. So out of all the thousands of hadiths and out of all the hundreds of hadiths regarding khuffain, regarding leather socks, you can only find 3 where he actually says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over non-leather socks. Now the answer given by a very famous alim and a mufti in the name of Hazrat Mufti Taqi Uthmani Damat Barakatuhu, he has said that the hadith narrated by Hazrat Bilal radhiyallahu anhu and that of Hazrat Abu Musa al-Ashari radhiyallahu anhu, which can be found respectively in Tabrani and in Sunan Ibn Majah, both hadiths are weak and da'if. Both hadiths are weak and da'if. Obviously this is not the time to actually go into why is it weak and why is it defective, but just generally speaking, it is weak and da'if. And with regards to the third hadith, which Hazrat Mughira bin Shu'bah radhiyallahu anhu has narrated, which can be found in Sunan Tirmidhi, that hadith, after the hadith, Imam Tirmidhi rahmatullah alayhi has said Haza hadithun hasanun sahihun. That this hadith is hasan, it's good, and it is authentic. Now, even though Imam Tirmidhi rahmatullahi has declared this hadith to be a sahih hadith or an authentic and a correct hadith, other eminent imams of hadith and of fiqh have categorically said that this particular hadith is weak and da'if. So other scholars such as like Imam Muslim rahmatullahi alayhi, other kind of great muhaddisins like Yahya bin Ma'in rahmatullahi alayhi have claimed or have said that the hadith which Imam Tirmidhi has said to be Hasanun Sahih, it is in fact weak and da'if. So therefore the conclusion and the khulasa which we can get is that the three hadiths which says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over non-leather socks over jawrab is in fact weak and da'if. So therefore we will have to act upon, going back to what I mentioned right at the beginning, that we should act upon the Quran, which quite clearly says wash your feet, and also the hadith, like in situations like in the winter where it may be cold, or in other situations where you may be traveling and so on, and if it is more convenient and more better, then what you can do is you could wear leather socks, as long as the khuffain or the sock you're wearing or socks you are wearing matches the three conditions I mentioned before, then you can do masa over them and your wuzu will be considered valid and accepted. Now, as I mentioned before, that the issue of doing masa over leather socks and the issue in particular of masa over non-leather socks is something where there is a consensus of all the imams and all the jurists. And they've quite clearly and categorically said that nylon socks or woolen socks, you can't do masa over them. Now this takes me onto a question or a problem which some students, in particular those who study at universities, may incur, or sometimes when you go to certain masjids where you may find this particular situation. And that is that there may be some people, you have seen them, they're doing wuzu. So they're doing wuzu, they're washing their face, they're washing their arms and so on. And they're wearing nylon socks. So instead of taking their nylon socks off and washing their feet, they just done masa over them and they're out of the wuzu area, and now they've gone to the musalla and they're leading the prayer. So what should you do in that situation? Should you actually read namaz behind them, or should you just like forget it and go home or go to the nearest masjid, whatever, what you're supposed to do? Now with regards to such a masla or such a issue, is that if you know that this particular imam, or if you've attended such a masjid where you know that these people do masa over their nylon socks, and you've seen them, and you know that they do it, then in that situation it is best that you don't read namaz behind them. Now, I'm not trying to cause ikhtilaf or differences here, but sometimes when the texts of the Holy Quran and the Hadith are clear, and when the texts of our jurists are clear, then you have to act upon it. And when our jurists have said that if somebody does masa over their nylon socks, their wuzu isn't valid, so therefore, if an imam has done masa over his nylon socks and he's reading or he's leading the prayer, then his wuzu isn't valid. So basically, you've just read namaz behind the imam who hasn't done his wuzu properly. So what's going to happen is that your namaz and your salah is not going to be accepted. So what you can do, well, you shouldn't even actually follow the imam in that situation, because if you know that he's done this, then you intentionally are reading namaz behind someone who you know who's not in the state of wudu. So therefore it's best that you don't actually go to that masjid or read namaz behind such people, because what you will have to do at the end, if you did read namaz or salah, you probably will have to repeat it afterwards. So that's, remember, under the condition or under the assumption that you know that these people are doing it. Because sometimes they may be from a different school of thought or from a different kind of madhab, but they may still wash their feet. And if you know that these people, they still wash their feet, or you've probably seen the imam before he's leading the prayer that he's washed his feet, then in that situation you can read namaz behind them. However, when you know that this is their practice, this is their common practice, this is what they normally and generally do, and especially for students who are going to universities and so on, generally speaking, what happens is that, especially like a university and so on, where there may not be any adequate wuzu facilities, and many of them probably doing wuzu in the basin which is in the toilet area, so many of them, they cannot be actually bothered taking off their socks. So what they will do, they will just do their wuzu, just do masa over their socks. Some of them will even do masa over their shoes, and then actually will go and lead the prayer. So if you are reading salah behind them, then your namaz is not going to be accepted. So therefore it's best that either you, in that situation, you try to be the imam. Okay, my advice will be that you, in that situation, if you know that some people are doing these things, then instead of being at the last saf or in the last row and being shy and not being the imam, you should try to be brave in that situation, and you should take over the mantelpiece and say, okay, I'll be the imam. So you try to be the imam, you try to lead the prayer, or if you can't do that, then it's best that you don't read salah, because most likely your namaz will not be accepted and you will have to repeat it all over again. Now before we look at the actual text, just a few things before we look at the text, few other rulings and masails. The first masla, or the first ruling, is that for masa al-khuffain to be correct, or for masa over your leather socks to be correct, it is necessary that you wear your leather socks after you have done a complete wudu, or to be in the state of wudu basically. For example, if you are not in the state of wudu and you just put on your leather socks, that is invalid. So therefore, the next time when you now break your wuzu, or the next time you then plan to do wuzu, you can't just do wuzu and then do masa over your leather socks, because you haven't worn it in the state of wudu. So it's necessary that you firstly do a complete wuzu, and then afterwards you then put on your leather socks and your khuffayn. So that is the first ruling. The second ruling is that for a musafir, or for a traveler, the period for masa lasts for 72 hours. So a traveler, if he's traveling somewhere, then for him, the period for masa lasts for 72 hours. So just say, for example, like he's in Birmingham now at the moment, but, well, I'm going to mention this later, but when he, for example, then plans to travel, and he then starts traveling, and then whilst traveling, he then breaks his wuzu. So from there, the 72 hours will start. So for a musafir, or for a traveler, the period for masa lasts for 72 hours, whereas for a mukim, or a resident, you call him, who's living within the city, or who's going to be within the city, is not going to be venturing here and there, then for that person it is 24 hours. The third ruling, which is very, very important, is that this period of 72 hours or 24 hours starts after you break your wuzu, and it does not start after you put on your khuffayn, or after you put on your leather socks. Now this is something which is very important, and it has to be made clear, because a lot of people, they assume that my 72 hours or my 24 hours start after I put my leather socks on. But that is not the case. It actually starts from the moment you next break your wuzu. So you could, like, for example, put your leather socks on at 8 o'clock in the evening, but if you say, for example, broke your wuzu at 10 o'clock, then from 10 o'clock, that's when the 24-hour period will start. Or that's, if you are traveling, that's when the 72-hour period will start. It doesn't start from the moment you put on your khuffayn, or from the moment you put on your leather socks. It starts after you break your wuzu. And the next ruling, or the next kind of section here, is with regards to factors that nullify the masa. So just very quickly, just some rulings or some maslas where, or situations where your masa over your leather socks or over your khuffain will break. Now the first situation is that all factors that nullify your wuzu will also nullify your masa. But the only difference is that you don't have to take off your leather socks. You just do masa over the leather socks and that will be sufficient. So you're in the state of wuzu and you've got your leather socks on. So when you break your wuzu, so again, like basically your body now is in the state of hadath asghar, in need of wuzu. So therefore what you will do is that you will just do your wuzu as normal and then you will just do masa or redo masa over your leather socks and that will be sufficient. The next ruling is that when the period of masa breaks or comes to an end, or if you take off your khuffain or if you take off your leather socks, then in those two situations only the khuffain taharat, or only the khuffain part, or only the feet, shall I say, becomes impure and not the rest of your body. So therefore what you do in that situation is that you just wash your feet, put your khuffain back on, and that's it, and you can continue reading namaz or doing whatever. So let me give you an example. Just say you're in the state of wuzu, you got your khuffain on and so on. You got your leather socks on. You're in the state of wuzu, you haven't broken a wuzu. Now what happened was that, just say at 10 o'clock the previous evening, the 24-hour period started. So 10 o'clock today or tonight, the 24-hour period finished. Now when your 24-hour period finished at 10 o'clock in the evening, you were in the state of wuzu. So you didn't break your wuzu, you were already in the state of wuzu. So therefore what you do is, at 10 o'clock you just take off your socks, you wash your feet, you put your socks back on again, and that's it. There's no need for you to repeat the whole wuzu again, because you're already in the state of wuzu. So therefore when the period finishes, you just take your socks off, wash your feet, and then put it back on again, and that's it. You could now continue with your ibadat if you're doing any, or touching the Quran or reading Quran, whatever you're doing, or whatever ibadat requires wuzu, you can do that. And the same also applies for taking off your socks as well. Again, taking off your socks breaks your khuffain, masala khuffain. But again, there's no need for you to repeat the whole wuzu again. What you just do is that you just wash your feet, put your khuffain back on, and that's it. You can continue with what you're doing. So besides the first situation where obviously your wuzu breaks, that's different. You will have to repeat the wuzu. But in the two which I've just mentioned here, in that situation you just have to just remove the khuffain, the leather socks, wash your feet, put your leather socks back on again, and that's it. You're now clean and you're now pure. And another important ruling here is that for masal khuffain, or for leather socks, if a person has a wet dream, or if he, say for example, is in need of a bath, i.e. had sexual intercourse with his wife, then in that situation masa over his leather socks or khuffain would not be sufficient. But instead he will have to take it off and wash his feet completely. The same way he'll be washing his body, he will also be washing his feet as well. So for example, if a person, say, was sleeping, he had his leather socks on and he had a wet dream. So in that situation, it's not sufficient for him to just have a ghusl and then when he comes to washing his feet, he just does masa over it. That would not be sufficient. But instead he will have to take off his khuffain and then wash his feet properly, the same way he'll be washing the rest of his body properly, because he's in hadath akbar, in need of a bath. It will also be necessary and obligatory for him to wash his feet as well. What I'm trying to say is that masa al-khuffain, the validity, it's only applicable if for a person who is in need of wuzu, who is in the hadath asghar state. So for a person who is in need of wuzu, who is in the hadath asghar state, for that person masa al-khuffain is sufficient. But for a person who is in need of a bath, then masal al-khuffain will not do the trick. That's what I'm trying to say. But instead, he will have to take off his khuffain and then wash his feet. Then all his body will become pak and pure. And it's the opposite of tayammum, what we looked at last week. Because for tayammum, if you remember, I mentioned that if a person does have a wet dream and the water is too cold for him to use, then if he was to do tayammum, that will be considered sufficient. But for khuffain, if a person has a wet dream, then he will have to take it off and wash his feet and obviously wash all his bodies so that it becomes pak. I'm just going to have a look at the text which is in front of us. The author Imam Quduri rahmatullahi begins by saying, Al-massu al-khuffain ja'izun bis-sunnah. So he says that doing massa over the leather socks is jaiz. Jaiz meaning something which is permissible, allowed, valid, bis-sunnah. And by using the word sunnah, he's indicating that this is such an obligation or such a ruling which is absolutely established from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and not from the Quran. I said this at the beginning, that unlike tayammum, where there are verses of tayammum in the Holy Quran, unlike the procedure of wuzu which is mentioned in the Holy Quran, the actual rulings regarding masa over your leather socks is established entirely from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So established from hadith. Min kulli hadathin mujibun lil wudu. From every impurity, mujibun lil wudu, which makes wudu wajib and obligatory. Again, what I've just mentioned, that masa al-khuffain is only sufficient or allowed if a person is in need of wuzu, i.e. in the state of hadath asghar. If he's had a wet dream, then in that situation, masa al-khuffain would not be considered sufficient. Iza labis al-khuffain ala tahara, when he wears the khuffain or the socks in the state of purity and taharat, and then afterwards he breaks his wuzu. So again, I explained this already, that the condition is that you wear your leather socks after you have done wuzu before. If you haven't done wuzu before and you're just wearing your leather socks, then in that situation, you won't be, or this particular ruling would not be applicable. You won't be able to do masa over your leather socks, and that period lasting for 24 hours, that would not be allowed. But instead, you will have to do wuzu before, like a full, complete wuzu, including, washing your face, your arms, your masa over your head, and then washing your feet completely, and then putting on the socks. The next text, the author goes on to say that فَإِنْ كَانَ مُقِيمًا, that if an individual is a muqim or is a local person, a resident, then he will do masa yawman wa layla for 1 day and 1 night, i.e. for 24 hours. So his period will last for 24 hours. Then he goes on to say, وَإِنْ كَانَ مُسَافِرًا مَسَحَ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ وَلَيَالِيهَا, that if a person is a musafir and a traveler, so for this individual it will last for 3 days and 3 nights. وَإِبْتِدَاؤُهَا أَقِيبَ الْحَدَثِ, again already been mentioned this particular masla, and that is that the period of khuffain will start after you break your wuzu. So it doesn't start the 24 hours or the 72 hours respectively. It doesn't start from the moment or from the time you put on your leather socks, but instead it starts after you break your wuzu. So when you break your wuzu, so it could be like 24 hours later, you could have broken your wuzu. Now it could be even like 2 days after you've broken your wuzu. So even then, the 24-hour period will start after that. The next text, the author then goes on to mention exactly how to do masa over the khuffain. And he says that وَالْمَسُّ عَلَى الْخُفَّيْنِ عَلَى ظَاهِرِهِمَا, that you will do masa over your leather socks on the top part of the khuffain, on the top part of the socks. And you will begin from the toes ila saq, and you will finish all the way up to your shins. Now the procedure of doing masal khuffain is that, again, this is what the Sharia has told us, because obviously our logic says that we should be doing masa on the sole of the khuffain, because obviously the sole, i.e. the bottom part, that is what is used for walking and for running. So it makes sense that we should do masa on the bottom part. But because there are hadiths which quite clearly indicates that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa on the top, so therefore we do masa on the top part. And the way you do masa, the sunnah procedure performing masa is that you get these three fingers. Well, actually, if you're doing use the right hand for the right leather socks and right leather sock, and the left hand for the left hoof and for the left leather sock. And what you'll do is that you get these three fingers and you will start from the toes, and then you will draw it upwards all the way up to your shins, or all the way up to the upper part of your feet, or all the way up to where the hoof will be. So you should draw it from the toes all the way up to your shins. So that is the procedure, or the sunnah procedure of performing the performing the masa over the khuffain and over the leather socks. Because the next text then goes on to say that the author says, وَفَرْضُ ذَلِكَ مِقْدَارُ ثَلَاثِ أَصَابِعْ مِنْ أَصَابِعِ الْيَدِ, which means that it is first to make masa on each sock to the extent of the full surface area of three fingers. So what does that mean? It means that as long as an area which is equivalent to three fingers on your hoof is white or is wet, then the masa will be considered valid and sufficient. Now basically done. So the procedure which I mentioned, that is just the sunnah procedure, that you start from your toes all the way up to your shins. But if a person, say for example, just gets his three fingers and just like rubs it on the top part once, so because the area of three fingers is wet on the khuffain, on the leather sock, then his masa will be valid and sufficient. Okay, so what I mentioned before, what I showed you, that is the sunnah way, and obviously we advise that you do it that way, following the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. However, for the actual masa to be considered valid and sufficient, that is that an area equivalent to three fingers, if that is wet, whether you use these three fingers or whether you want to use a thumb or whatever, or whether you want to use the back of your hand or anything, as long as the area of three fingers is wet or wiped over on the hoof, on the leather sock, then your masa will be considered valid and accepted. The next ruling the author mentions, وَلَا يَجُوزُ الْمَسْحُ عَلَى خُفٍّ فِيهِ خَرْقٌ كَثِيرٌ يَتَبَيَّنُ مِنْهُ قَدْرُ ثَلَاثِ أَصَابِعِ الرِّجْلِ وَإِنْ كَانَ أَقَلَّ مِنْ ذَلِكَ جَازَ, which very basically or very briefly means that it is not permissible to make masa on a khuf that is torn to such an extent that area which is equal to three small toes are exposed. So the next ruling the author is telling us about what kind of khufs or on what kind of leather socks you can actually do masa on. So if the khuf or the leather sock is such that, or is ripped in different places, which is equivalent to the area of three small toes, then you won't be able to do masa over that particular hoof or leather sock. So just say if it's like ripped here near the toe area or around the heel area and so on, and if you were to count it or calculate it, it would be approximately equal to the area of three small toes, then you won't be able to do masa on that. And remember, it has to be the exposure of three small toes. It applies for each hoof and for each leather sock. So we won't actually count it from both, if you know what I mean. So just say if it's like a bit ripped here on the right hoof and a bit ripped on the left. So we won't add it up together and say, oh, it's equivalent to three small toes, therefore you can't do masa on both of them. So that's not the ruling. But it has to be on each hoof or on each hoof. If it's the rip or the exposure is equivalent to three small toes, then you won't be able to do masa on that. And the author goes on to say that وَإِنْ كَانَ أَقَلَّ مِنْ ذَلِكَ, that if it's less than that, then it will be permissible to do masa on. The last ruling before we finish, the author mentions وَلَا يَجُوزُ الْمَسْحُ عَلَى الْخُفَّيْنِ لِمَنْ وَجَبَ عَلَيْهِ الْغُسْلُ. That it is not permissible for a person to do masa or wipe his wet hands over the leather socks if ghusl is obligatory and wajib upon him. So again, I've kind of explained this ruling before, and that is that if a person is in need of a bath, he's had a wet dream, or he's just engaged in sexual intercourse with his wife, so for such a person, it will not be permissible for him to do masa over his khuffain and his leather socks. But instead, he will be required to take off his leather socks and wash his feet, and through that way, the same way he'll be washing his whole body to become park and pure, then by washing his feet, he will become park and pure. So we'll just leave it there for this week. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to act upon what's been said. Wa akhiru da'wan alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Be a student of knowledge.